I'm Brandon Richards. This is your Momentum Moment. There is something that happens in a person that nobody talks about clearly enough. You react to something, like a tone of voice, a look, being left out of a conversation, or feeling dismissed, and the reaction is bigger than what just happened. And you know it is. Sometimes you know it in the moment and you still cannot stop it. Sometimes you only see it after, when the dust has settled and you're trying to figure out what that was all about. And most people assume the reaction is about whatever just happened. That is not how it works. That is not how the brain works at all. And right now, some of the most sophisticated technology in the world is built around a single idea: pattern matching. AI facial recognition doesn't think or reason. It scans a face, measures it, encodes it, and searches a database for the closest match. It doesn't need an exact match. It just needs close enough. And the moment it finds one, it fires a response. And your brain has been doing the same thing since you were born. Deep inside the brain is a structure called the amygdala. And one of its key jobs is to scan everything happening around you and ask two questions. Have I seen this before? And is this a threat? There are two pathways the brain can take: a fast one that goes straight through the amygdala, and a slower one that goes through rational thought. The fast one often wins. And the brain doesn't always differentiate well past a threat and a present situation, that it doesn't know the difference between that. So by the time the thinking part of your brain knows what happened, the old file is already open and the old response is already running. And this is not a character flaw. That is code doing exactly what it was written to do in a situation it was never written for. The code was written early, written under pressure, by experiences that had to mean something so that survival was possible. A kid who learned that expressing need led to punishment learns to suppress need. Someone who has been repeatedly dismissed learns to stop speaking or to over-explain everything in anticipation of not even being believed. A person who has been abandoned at a formative moment learns to read every relationship for the early signs of the same thing coming again. The code was not irrational when it was written. It was protective. It served a real purpose in a real situation. The problem is that the body does not know the original situation is over. The nervous system has no timestamp. And as far as it's concerned, it's not happening again. It's just happening. Same chemistry, same pathways, same intensity. And that is the gap between what just set you off and how big the response was. In the Bible, Paul has a word for what this becomes over time, and he calls them strongholds. He writes in 2 Corinthians 10, 4-5, "The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ." And the first thing worth noticing here is where Paul begins, not with the stronghold, but with warfare. The weapons language is not decorative, okay? He is describing an actual conflict over actual ground. And the ground being contested is not somewhere out there. It is inside the thought life, the belief systems, the interpretive frameworks through which a person understands themselves and understands what is happening to them. And a stronghold is not a bad habit. It is a fortified structure built around a wound, reinforced over time, with walls that exist specifically to keep certain things out, including truth. And because it is fortified, it tends to protect itself. Once a belief like that gets written in, everything starts to organizing around it and keeping it in place. That is why willpower does not touch it. And that is why a person can do years of honest work on themselves and the same pattern keeps firing. You can modify behavior around a stronghold without ever addressing what is holding it. And sometimes there's more going on than just wiring in old memories. That is not something to assume. That is something that requires real discernment. But it's worth naming here because it is part of why the weapons Paul describes are not human ones. Something with divine power is required because what is holding the ground is not always psychological. So what does it actually look like to address this rather than to manage around it? It starts with tracing the reaction past the error message. When something gets set off, the reaction itself is just the crash report. The bug is deeper. The question is not what happened today, but what today rhymed with. What is the original wound this response was written to protect? Because that is where the root is, and that is where the work has to happen. And then there is a gap between the alarm and the action. The alarm going off cannot always be prevented, but there is a space between when it fires and when the old program runs its full course. So learning to stay in that space, to pause before the response takes over, that's not passivity. It is the beginning of being able to choose something different than what the code would have chosen automatically. And James 5:16 says, confess your faults to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. Strongholds are maintained by silence. They do not need active defense in the open. They only need to stay hidden, unnamed, unexamined. Naming what is actually happening to God and to a saved person is how the walls start to come down. What cannot be named cannot be addressed. And the belief at the root has to be confronted directly, not managed around, confronted. Every stronghold is built on something that got accepted as true under pressure. Don't forget that. I don't matter. I'm not safe. I will always be left. I'm the problem. Those beliefs not yield to positive thinking. They have to be met with the word of God spoken directly against them. Romans 12:2 calls this the renewal of the mind. The Greek word, and I'm no Greek person, so bear with me here, anakinosis, a complete renovation from the inside out, not an update, a rewrite. And the amygdala learns from experience, which means it can be retrained. And every time a new response is chosen instead of the old program, new code runs. The old pattern loses authority. Not because the person became stronger on their own, because something stronger than what wrote the original code is doing the rewriting. The bug is not who you are. It is what got written into you before you had any say in it, by situations that required a response, and the response that got written was the one available at the time. That is not identity, that is history. And history, unlike identity, can be rewritten. Not as though it didn't happen, but addressed at the root and replaced with something written by a different hand under a different authority, telling a truer story about who you actually are. I'm Brandon, and this is your Momentum Moment.